Thank you all for joining us. Good evening, good morning, afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. My name is Hila Shamir, and I lead TraffLab, Labor Approach to Human Trafficking, the research group. And I'm a law professor at Tel Aviv University. And thank you all for coming today to launch our collaborative work, the Alternative Anti-Trafficking Action Plan, a proposed model based on a labor approach to trafficking. I'm going to share screen for a second. So some housekeeping reminders. Please, Please keep yourself on mute if you can during the talk, and we will have a Q&A session at the end of each of the two parts of today's event. Please feel free to write your questions in the chat, and we will present them to the speakers, or again, depending on order, we may be able to allow you to open the mic and ask your questions. So the event today will have two parts. We'll begin by a keynote talk by Professor Sivan Molali, the UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children, followed by Q&A. And then we'll move on to a roundtable discussion chaired by Hani Ben Israel with four wonderful scholars, Joel Quirk, Virginia Montevelo, Janie Chuang, and Maya Niazna, followed by an open discussion with all of you that we look forward to. So before we begin, and before, here I see Sivan joined us with camera. Hi, Sivan. It's such an honor to have you here. So before we start, I will take approximately 15 minutes to present the alternative anti-trafficking plan that we're launching today. And then we will move to our keynote talk for the day. Okay, so the TraffLab Alternative Anti-Trafficking Action Plan aims to offer an alternative vision to how to address human trafficking, given what we perceive to be the failure of the dominant anti-trafficking approach to address the structural root causes that sustain and enable severe forms of labor market exploitation. The authors of this alternative plan, many of them are here with us today, are researchers in the field of migration and labor in Israel, specializing in the study of human trafficking in various disciplines. We collaborated as part of the research group TraffLab, funded by the European Research Council. Some of us were involved in the working teams in connection with Israel's National Action Plan to combat human trafficking that we will mention, I'll mention throughout the talk today. So we developed this alternative plan to demonstrate how, in our view, a plan to combat human trafficking that seeks to address its root causes would look like, and to explain how it could effectively work to reduce severe exploitation in the Israeli labor market. The alternative plan sets forth direction that we believe should be taken to address the structural elements underpinning human trafficking in the contemporary Israeli labor market, elements that we believe the prevailing approach for combating human trafficking addresses inadequately. Taken as a whole, the alternative plan offers an ambitious vision and plan of action for a possible policy agenda, firmly based on the existing legal framework and the current situation in Israel, yet seeking to offer a fresh perspective that aims to identify and recognize that the forces driving human trafficking in Israel and the limitations of the solutions adopted thus far, and to propose an alternative solution for addressing them effectively. And I invite you all to read the full report that is available online at our website. But in the time I have today, I'll begin by explaining the need for an alternative approach. I'll provide some background about the situation in Israel, and I will then highlight areas in which our plan provides a different toolkit to address human trafficking than those commonly used, and areas in which we seek to expand the existing toolkit and look at areas and issues often overlooked in anti-trafficking law and policy. What we believe shows the urgent need for an alternative approach is this slide, showing us, again, under the most generous calculations, nobody talks today about 2.4 million victims of trafficking, though, again, we all know that the numbers are messy, and maybe we'll discuss it later. But even if we take this really tiny, the very, very modest estimate that 2.4 million people are victims of trafficking around the world, which was the ILO estimation in 2008, Under the most generous calculation, approximately 5% of trafficked persons worldwide are directly assisted by the current anti-trafficking framework. So for anyone working in this field, and so many of us are here with us today, it's a conundrum, right? Despite the, oops, sorry. Where did my slide go? Here, sorry, my slide disappeared. Despite the renewed international, national, and civil society commitment to combat trafficking in the last 2 decades, and the very generous resources dedicated to it, there is no sign, and nobody's trying to argue, that the number of human beings trafficked decreased over the years. And how can this be? How come so much efforts and energies are going to this, and there is so little change? And that's where some of what we're doing started. And I will say that the number, the 5% that I'm referring to, comes from the Trafficking in Persons report, the US State Department report, that in 2021 talked about 109,000 victims identified. I'm not even saying assisted. So, you know, that's when states want to inflate their numbers. So why is that? What can explain these absolutely low numbers? What can explain the mismatch between effort and outcome? In our research group, we suggest that the reason for the ineffective response lies in the use of policy responses that do not address the root causes of human trafficking and provide only ex post assistance rather than preventive ex ante measures. So the accepted approach to combating human trafficking includes criminalizing human trafficking, the first P, prosecution, right? These are the 3 Ps. Tightening border controls and occasionally closing borders entirely to groups perceived as particularly vulnerable to exploitation, and this would usually be thought of as prevention, and providing assistance and rehabilitation to individual victims who have been recognized as such after they've been rescued, right? And this is what we think of as protection. The main rights granted to identify trafficked persons include guaranteeing victims of trafficking that they will not be prosecuted for their lack of legal status if they don't have one in the country, operating victim shelters, and providing special visas and residence permits for recognizing victims. In most countries, the rehabilitation process ends in repatriation. This approach focuses on the individual criminal and the individual victim and sees human trafficking as an exceptional crime. It aims to save and rescue individuals from exploitative working environments and to ensure that they subsequently receive support through rehabilitation, rescue, and repatriation in the best scenario to their countries of origin. This set of measures sees trafficked individuals as passive victims. Although this approach may clearly offer important assistance to some of those who've been subject to human trafficking, it addresses only the symptoms of the problem and not its underlying causes. It fails to address the economic, social, and legal conditions that make workers vulnerable to exploitation, and for the most part is ineffective in curbing human trafficking. As a result, we argue the dominant anti-trafficking approach reaches a very small number of individuals, and there is no sign that it deters or reduces occurrences of human trafficking. In view of the inadequacy of the existing framework, we've based this plan on the beyond criminalization approach and an alternative approach to combating human trafficking, which we refer to as a labor approach. So just quickly, because I know many of you are familiar with this approach, the labor approach to human trafficking views the roots of the phenomenon in the exploitation of power disparities in the labor market. The current dominant approach focuses on rescuing and assisting victims after their exploitation, and it's very important, but it settles for raising awareness and providing information as sufficient prevention tools, thus reflecting a perception of human trafficking as an exceptional crime. In contrast, the labor approach seeks to implement changes in the structures of the labor market in which workers are particularly vulnerable to trafficking. This approach shifts the focus from individual harms towards structural causes that shape the power disparities between victims and traffickers, the social and economic conditions that enable severe labor market exploitation, and ex ante rather than ex post assistance. So the basic premise of the labor approach is that human trafficking is not solely a criminal phenomenon executed by criminal elements, but rather that it should be understood as a labor market phenomenon. Adopting and implementing a labor approach requires considering that an individual's bargaining power in accordance with his or her vulnerability to exploitation is shaped by a complex of complex mix of legal, economic, cultural, and identity-based factors. Some of these factors are structural and derive from the migration, labor, welfare, and criminal justice policies of the country in which the exploitation occurs, or the destination country, or the sending country. Structural elements may arise from the migration regime, as well as from labor, welfare, and criminal law. So that's where we start the quest for this program. And we wrote our alternative plan around several main structural elements that we identified, focusing our attention on prevention and enforcement, as well as identifying partners for effective structural change and its implementation. The desired outcome is a change in the structural conditions, economic and legal, to prevent the creation of an environment that enables and facilitates severe forms of labor market exploitation. Before I turn to highlight some elements from the report, from the plan, let me provide you with a very brief background about anti-trafficking in Israel. So for a time, Israel anti-trafficking efforts could have been seen as a success story. The success story is what you see here until 2012 and maybe actually until 2020, at least as reflected in the TIP report, the Trafficking in Persons report. Trafficking for the purpose of prostitution identified as a significant problem in the late 1990s in Israel, was practically eradicated by the late 2000s. The Israeli state accomplished this by using the traditional anti-trafficking toolkit, combining aggressive prosecution, significant penalties for perpetrators with strict border control measures, deporting victims and preventing new ones from entering. There was also an extensive and generous layer of human rights support for those identified, but the victims identified, but those were very few. These measures, while contested, were highly effective in achieving their objective in relation to non-Israeli women in the sex industry. And they had significant negative impact on some sex workers, and these issues are fascinating, but beyond the scope of my talk today. The same tools, however, are much less effective when deployed in relation to other labor sectors. Yet even these ineffective tools were not deployed in relation to labor exploitation outside the sex industry. Israel's response to trafficking for labor exploitation was never as intense or as successful as it was in relation to sex trafficking. It lacked the commitment the government showed to ending trafficking for sexual exploitation, as well as a strong understanding of what fuels and shapes severe labor market exploitation in Israel. The new National Action Plan to Combat Human Trafficking in Israel that was presented and published in early 2019 offered more of the same. Its emphasis on awareness raising, training, and victim support, combined with its neglect of the laws and practices enabling abuse in the first place, makes the same tired mistakes. We believe that without a change of approach, this plan will lead to the same unsatisfactory results. Severe forms of labor market exploitation manifest in the Israeli labor market mostly in relation to non-citizen workers, whether documented migrant workers on temporary work visas in agriculture, construction, and care, and there are about 100,000 such migrants, at least in 2022, and documented Palestinian workers who enter Israel as day laborers from the occupied territories to work in a variety of sectors, and there are about 87,000 such workers. In order to understand the limited scale of activities to combat human trafficking in other areas outside of the sex industry, it's sufficient to examine the criminal enforcement system in place. The number of victims identified outside of the sex industry remains extremely low, and there have been only 2 convictions for what is called under Israeli law holding under conditions of slavery, kind of modern slavery, and only one of which involved migrant workers. The second involved cults. The sole conviction for holding migrant workers under conditions of slavery was obtained in 2012. Despite the lack of enforcement surrounding labor trafficking, few steps have been taken in Israel to address the structural elements that create conditions conducive to the growth of human trafficking. So first was a High Court of Justice ruling avoiding the binding arrangement. And the second was following from proceedings that began with a petition to the High Court of Justice by civil society organizations. The state recognized that the high recruitment fees migrant workers were being charged led to debt burdens and made the workers vulnerable. So over the last decade, the Israeli government has entered into bilateral labor agreements with various migrant workers' countries of origin. These agreements have led to reduction in the recruitment fees paid by migrant workers. Despite these very positive developments, there's also a very visible reduction in the effectiveness of these 2 measures relating to tied visas and debt. which are being eroded and circumvented. First, in the years that have passed since the High Court of Justice binding judgment, there has been a clear trend of erosion of the sweeping ban on binding and a slow return to binding arrangements, especially in the care sector, but also we see some areas in construction and agriculture where this is the case. And second, in parallel with the signing of bilateral agreements, recent years have shown a rise in the development of alternative recruiting methods designed to circumvent these agreements and to continue to recruit migrants who pay high recruitment fees. In the alternative plan we wrote, we identified several key structural elements that require addressing. Binding and recruitment fees are chief among them, and Maayan will perhaps mention a little bit these elements as well in her talk in the second half of the event today. But even though we offer some concrete and innovative solutions in relation to this issue, these are nonetheless issues that where there is, or at least used to be, agreement that action is required. Yet beyond tight visas and recruitment fees, the plan turns to various other structural elements that are not commonly part of the anti-trafficking toolkit. So let me just highlight a few of these. First, the Israeli government is careful to state in the national program, at least in the recent one, that trafficking policy is distinct from migration policy. We believe otherwise. In the opening chapter, Avinoam Cohen explains how migration and labor market policies may create vulnerability to human trafficking and underscores the need to rethink some of their building blocks. This remains true, we argue, even under the presumption that Israel's migration policy is going to be restrictive, based on the right of return and designed to prevent migrant workers from settling in Israel. We call for reshaping aspects of the migration policy and ensuring periodic review of specific areas and their implications to avoid neglect. Another element we address is the role of intermediaries, and particularly of recruitment and placement agencies. In her chapter, Yael Kurlandale shows that a reform in the regulation of intermediaries under Israeli law had positioned them as key actors in the migratory process, with responsibility to enforce and implement components of Israel's migration programs. Yet there is great discrepancy between the alleged responsibility of these agencies to facilitate labor market mobility and protect workers' rights, and the system of distorted incentives that leads them to primarily serve the interest of employers. We therefore propose a fundamental and systematic reform to existing employment patterns and institutions in a manner that addresses the inherent conflict of interests faced by placement agencies and eliminates their financial incentives to oversee and very often overlook worker exploitation. We believe that reforming the responsibilities and remuneration structures of intermediaries can be a promising way forward, particularly if combined with guaranteeing collective representation for migrant workers in the sector vis-a-vis the agencies. This can be a way to dismantle existing structures under which the state sanctions exploitation. The plan also looks at the issue of the current national issues that the current national anti-trafficking plan does not address at all. That of the application and enforcement of protective employment legislation. We believe protective employment legislation is the cornerstone of protecting workers' rights in general and the rights of vulnerable workers in particular. In Israel, migrant workers currently suffer from de jure exclusion from some protective legislation, as well as from a de facto lack of enforcement of the rights they do have. Hani Ben Israel, in her chapter, proposes the application and enforcement of protective legislation as a central tool in the prevention of human trafficking. This would include, we suggest, revoking the requirement that care workers live in the homes of their employers, applying the hours of work and rest law to them, re-examining the residency and employment conditions for volunteers and students in work-study programs in agriculture, promoting workers' rights enforcement mechanisms, allocating labor inspectors with sufficient resources and guiding them to strategically target sectors in which workers are particularly prone to exploitation, and guaranteeing equal access to the labor courts for non-Israeli workers. Maayan Yezna in her chapters adds to this the urgent need to reform the current enforcement mechanism by establishing a special investigative expert unit to deal with slavery and forced labor offenses and develop an integrated and strategic enforcement in collaboration with other enforcement agencies, as well as co-enforcement with civil society actors. Well, the traditional third P is prosecution. In our plan, we argue for partnerships. partnerships with workers, their families, their communities, with unions and workers' organizations, and also with corporations. Elements that are currently mostly left out altogether from many strategic anti-trafficking plans, including the Israeli one. Shachar Shoam and Hani Ben Israel write about the important role of family, community, and social networks in protecting the rights and dignity of migrant workers. The plan identifies the connection between policies designed to prevent migrant workers from settling in Israel, limiting community and family life and access to support networks, and the creation of an environment in which severe forms of labor market exploitation thrive. We propose expanding the rights of migrants to family and community, including permitting migrants to form and maintain romantic and familial relationship after their arrival in Israel, a right they currently do not have. Granting migrants permission to remain in Israel with a work permit after giving birth, and removing barriers to family visits to enable maintaining family ties. Although such changes do challenge the rationale of preventing long-term settlement, which lies at the heart of Israel's labor migration policy, we believe they're important enough because they could reduce the individualization and instrumental treatment of workers and play an integral role in protecting their humanity. Similarly, the plan suggests that other power sources for workers are unions and workers' organizations. Asaf Bondi, in his chapter, focuses on the role of organized labor and the potential of trade unions in Israel to improve the working conditions of vulnerable workers and reduce vulnerability to trafficking. Trade unions around the world play an increasingly active role, not active enough, but increasingly active in preventing human trafficking through collective action, a trend that so far has not been replicated at all in Israel. We argue that trade unions must develop inclusive collective action strategies, establish divisions dedicated to organizing migrant workers on both employer-based and sector-based levels, with the aim of increasing the representation of migrant workers in sectors vulnerable to trafficking. Sorry. We further propose establishment of a national council for labor migration that would bring together trade unions, employers, state representatives, civil society organizations, and migrant organizations that would serve as a forum for dialogue and consultation regarding changes to work migration programs and Israel labor migration policy. So we hope that this diverse range of policy proposals presented in the alternative plan will both facilitate a deeper understanding of the root causes of human trafficking in Israel and encourage a wide use of the rich toolbox at our disposal as a society to comprehensively address this phenomenon. The English version of this plan that we launched today reflects our understanding that while some issues and proposed solutions are unique to the Israeli context, many challenges are common to migrant receiving countries in the global north, and some issues may also be relevant to countries in the global south. Specific chapters of this plan may therefore assist practitioners, activists, and scholars elsewhere. We offer this plan as a tool for scholars, activists, and policymakers who may wish to take on similar endeavors in other contexts. We welcome requests for information and consultation about the process that led to this plan or any other aspect that might be helpful for similar projects. Human trafficking is not an inevitable reality. While it is possible to effectively combat human trafficking, to do so requires a willingness to address the structural elements, in our case, of Israel's migration regime and labor market regulation. We hope this plan can serve as a first step in that direction. So thank you for hearing me out. And I hope this kind of piqued your interest in our plan and will kind of encourage you to go and read the whole thing. And now